The man who made 11 employees quit in a single year had just walked through the door, and tonight, he was already looking for his next target. The dinner rush at Harbor and Stone always arrived like a tide. Slow at first, then all at once. The clink of glasses, the low hum of conversations, the scent of grilled steak and fresh rosemary drifting through the warm dining room. On most nights, the restaurant felt elegant, predictable, safe, but not tonight. The moment the hostess glanced through the front windows, something changed. Her smile disappeared, her shoulders stiffened, and without saying a word, she turned toward the staff station. "He's here." The words traveled faster than any alarm. Several servers exchanged nervous looks. One suddenly found a reason to reorganize silverware. Another disappeared into the kitchen. A third stared at the seating chart, as if it contained the answer to a life-or-death question. No one laughed. No one asked questions. They already knew exactly who she meant. Ethan Blackwell, the billionaire investor whose name appeared regularly on business magazine covers. The man who owned luxury hotels, commercial towers, and more restaurants than most people could count. A man worth billions. A man who could buy the entire block without checking his bank account. And somehow, despite all that success, the one thing he seemed to enjoy most was making service workers uncomfortable. Nobody knew why. Some said he enjoyed control. Others believed he simply liked reminding people who held the power. Whatever the reason, his reputation was legendary. Stories about him traveled through restaurant staff across Boston, the way sailors once shared stories about storms. Entire shifts had been ruined because of him. Careers had nearly ended because of him. At least 11 employees had resigned from different restaurants after repeated encounters with Ethan Blackwell over the previous year. Maybe that number was exaggerated. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, nobody wanted table 12 tonight. "I served him once," whispered a bartender. "Never again." Last month, he made a server rewrite an entire order 3 times because she missed one word. "I heard he got a manager fired. I heard he made someone cry." The rumors blended together, each one making the room feel smaller. 10 feet away, Claire Bennett was polishing wine glasses. She looked up from her work. "Who's Ethan Blackwell?" The question immediately drew several stares. Of course she didn't know. Claire had only been working there for 3 days. 27 years old. New to Boston. New to Harbor and Stone. New to all the unspoken rules everyone else seemed to understand. "Trust me," one server muttered. "You don't want to find out." Claire frowned slightly, but returned to her glass. She wasn't particularly interested in billionaires. She had spent the past few months worrying about rent, student loan payments, and finding stable work after relocating across the state. Rich people were background noise. Then the front doors opened. A gust of cool evening air swept inside. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Ethan Blackwell entered without hurry. Tall, broad-shouldered, mid-40s. His dark charcoal overcoat fit perfectly. Not flashy, not loud. The kind of clothing that didn't need logos because everyone already knew it was expensive. His expression remained unreadable as he scanned the dining room. The hostess greeted him immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell." He nodded once. Nothing more. No smile. No small talk. Just a brief glance across the room. Then it happened. His eyes settled on Claire. Only for a moment. A second, maybe less. Yet something about that look made him pause. The hostess noticed. The manager noticed. Even a few servers noticed. Ethan Blackwell removed his coat and handed it to the attendant. His gaze drifted back toward Claire. Then a faint smile appeared. Not warm. Not friendly. Curious. Almost calculating. "Who's the new waitress?" he asked quietly. The manager felt his stomach tighten. "Her name is Claire." Ethan nodded slowly. Interesting. That single word landed like a stone in still water. The manager already knew what was coming. Across the room, Claire remained completely unaware. She continued polishing glasses, oblivious to the attention focused on her. Oblivious to the whispers. Oblivious to the fact that every employee in the restaurant was silently hoping someone else would take table 12. Ethan Blackwell picked up the menu, settled into his chair, and without taking his eyes off the dining room, he said softly, "Let's see how long this one lasts." Claire Bennett had learned long ago that people revealed themselves when they believed no one was watching. That lesson had followed her from small-town diners to crowded city cafes, from community college classrooms to late-night shifts that stretched far beyond midnight. It was one of the few things she trusted completely. As the dinner rush continued around her, she carried a tray of sparkling water through harbor and stone with the same calm focus she brought to every task. Her movements were efficient, measured, quiet. She never rushed, even when everyone else did. 3 days earlier, she had walked into the restaurant carrying everything she owned in the back of a 12-year-old Honda Civic. 2 suitcases, a laptop that barely worked, and a cardboard box filled with books she could never bring herself to throw away. Boston was supposed to be a fresh start. Not a dream, not some grand adventure, just a chance to begin again. Her apartment sat above a laundromat 6 blocks away. The building was old. The floors creaked. The radiator rattled whenever the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. But it was affordable. That mattered more. Every morning, she walked 20 minutes to work carrying coffee in a reusable mug and a notebook filled with job applications she never talked about. Because Harbor and Stone was not the destination. It was simply the bridge. The place between where she had been and wherever life planned to take her next. Most of the staff assumed she was younger than she actually was. Claire did not correct them. Most assumed she had never worked anywhere important before. She did not correct that either. She had discovered that people often created stories about strangers. Sometimes it was easier to let them. Near the service station, 2 servers continued whispering about Ethan Blackwell. Their voices dropped every time they glanced toward table 12. Claire caught fragments. Difficult customer. Impossible standards. Nightmare. She listened without reacting. Every restaurant had a customer everyone feared. Every office had a boss nobody wanted to disappoint. Every town had a local legend that grew larger with each retelling. She suspected this billionaire was some combination of all 3. Yet what interested her more was not the man himself. It was everyone else's reaction to him. Fear had a way of spreading through a room. It moved faster than logic, faster than facts. She noticed it in the tight smiles, the nervous laughter, the way experienced servers suddenly became very interested in side work whenever table 12 was mentioned. Claire placed a basket of fresh bread on another table and smiled at an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. The husband thanked her. The wife complimented the restaurant. Normal people, normal conversations. She preferred those. Across the dining room, Ethan Blackwell sat alone beneath the warm glow of a chandelier. He had not opened his menu. He had not touched the water placed in front of him. Instead, he watched. Not obviously, not rudely, but carefully, like someone studying a puzzle. Claire noticed because she paid attention to details. Details often mattered. A manager approached her carrying a tablet. His expression looked almost apologetic. Claire. She turned. Yes. He hesitated. Just briefly. You have table 12. Around them, several employees suddenly became very busy. One server avoided eye contact altogether. Another quietly slipped into the kitchen. The reaction was almost comical. Claire looked toward the dining room, then back at the manager. That is all. The manager blinked. That is all. Okay. She set down her tray, smoothed the front of her black apron, picked up a notepad, and started walking toward the most feared table in the restaurant. Behind her, conversations seemed to pause. Not because anyone expected a disaster. Because everyone expected a story. What none of them knew was that Claire Bennett had spent years dealing with far more intimidating things than difficult customers. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Blackwell leaned back in his chair and smiled as he watched her approach. Claire stopped beside table 12 and offered the same professional smile she gave every guest in the restaurant. Nothing more, nothing less. Good evening, sir. My name is Claire. I will be taking care of you tonight. Ethan Blackwell looked up from his menu. For a moment, he said nothing. Most people rushed to fill silence. Claire did not. She simply waited. Calm. Patient. The billionaire studied her face as if comparing it to something only he could see. You are new, he finally said. 3rd day. And nobody warned you about me? A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. Claire glanced briefly toward the service station where several employees were pretending not to watch. I heard a few stories. Only a few. People seemed busy tonight. For the first time, something unexpected flickered across Ethan's face. Amusement. It disappeared almost immediately. What do you recommend? Claire handed him a menu. That depends. On what? Whether you want my honest recommendation or the most expensive thing on the menu. Ethan slowly closed the menu. Most people assume I want the expensive option. Most people assume a lot of things. The silence returned. Somewhere in the dining room, a wine glass clinked softly against another. Ethan leaned back slightly. "And what do you assume about me?" It was a question that sounded simple. It was not. Claire recognized that immediately. "I try not to make assumptions about people I just met." "That sounds cautious." "It saves time." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. Curiosity. Real curiosity. The kind that could not be faked. "Interesting answer." Claire opened her notepad. "Would you like a few more minutes?" "No." He closed the menu completely. "I will have the New York strip. Medium." Claire nodded. "Excellent choice." "And sparkling water." "Of course." She wrote the order quickly, efficiently. Then Ethan spoke again. "You are not nervous." Claire looked up. "Should I be?" Across the restaurant, two servers exchanged worried glances. One quietly muttered something under her breath. Everyone knew what usually happened next. Ethan Blackwell had a reputation for turning simple conversations into uncomfortable examinations. Yet Claire's expression never changed. "Most people are," Ethan said. "Maybe they have reasons. And you do not. I do not know you well enough to decide." Ethan stared at her for several seconds. Then he smiled again. This time the smile felt deliberate, calculated. "Bring me lemon with the water." "Certainly." "Fresh lemon." "Of course. Not bottled juice." "I understand." "And make sure the water is cold." Claire nodded once. "Anything else?" Ethan seemed almost disappointed by the question, as if he expected resistance. "No." "Then your order will be out shortly." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she could feel eyes following her. Not just Ethan's. Everyone's. The bartender looked confused. The hostess looked relieved. The manager looked cautiously optimistic. Claire simply delivered another table's appetizers and continued working. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying sparkling water, fresh lemon, and the exact meal Ethan had ordered. Everything arranged perfectly. Ethan glanced at the plate, then at the glass, then at the lemon. He inspected each item with surprising attention. Claire noticed something important. He was not looking for mistakes. He was looking for reactions, looking for frustration, looking for cracks. The realization settled quietly into her mind. This was not about food. It was never about food. Ethan Blackwell thanked her, and she walked away. 20 minutes later, he requested a different knife. 5 minutes after that, he asked for extra seasoning. Then another napkin. Then a fresh glass. None of the requests were unreasonable on their own. Yet together they formed a pattern, a rhythm, a test. Claire fulfilled each request without complaint, without visible irritation, without performing the exaggerated politeness some servers used when dealing with difficult guests. She simply did her job. The more composed she remained, the more Ethan seemed unsettled. For the first time all evening, the billionaire stopped watching everyone else. Now he watched only her. And somewhere deep inside, a question he had not expected began forming in his mind. Why was this waitress different from all the others? By 8 o'clock, most of the dining room had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a successful evening. Candles flickered softly against polished glass. Conversations rose and fell like distant waves. Outside, the city lights reflected across rain-darkened streets. Inside, however, a different kind of tension was slowly building. Ethan Blackwell had finished less than half his steak. Not because there was anything wrong with it. In fact, it had been prepared perfectly. Claire knew that. Ethan knew that too. Yet every few minutes another request appeared. Another small adjustment. Another reason to call her back to table 12. "Could you bring another side of asparagus?" "Certainly." "Actually, make that grilled vegetables." "Of course." 10 minutes later. "I think I preferred the asparagus." "I can take care of that." 5 minutes after that. "This water is no longer cold enough." "I will bring fresh ice." Claire handled each request exactly the same way. No sighs. No forced smiles. No visible irritation. The remarkable thing was not her patience. It was her consistency. Most people changed when pressure increased. Claire did not. Across the room, several employees watched the exchange unfold. The bartender shook his head. "He is doing it again." The hostess quietly nodded. "I know." How much longer before she loses her patience? Nobody answered. Because that was usually how these stories ended. Not with a dramatic argument. Not with raised voices. Just exhaustion. Frustration. A slow accumulation of tiny moments until someone finally snapped. Ethan seemed to understand that better than anyone. Claire returned with the replacement side dish. Ethan barely glanced at it. Instead, He folded his hands together. How long have you worked in restaurants? A while. That is not an answer. It answered the question. Ethan almost smiled again. You do that often. Do what? Answer without answering. Claire set down the plate carefully. Only when someone is asking a different question than the one they actually said out loud. For a brief moment, Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Then the expression vanished. And what question am I asking? I am still figuring that out. The response lingered between them. Not confrontational. Not defensive. Just honest. Ethan stared at her a second longer before reaching for his glass. Interesting. There was that word again. Claire noticed he used it whenever something failed to go according to plan. She walked away before he could add another request. Near the service station, the restaurant manager intercepted her. Everything okay? Claire nodded. Perfectly fine. You know he has asked for you 17 times tonight. Claire looked surprised. 17. I counted. She glanced toward table 12. Then maybe he is lonely. The manager laughed despite himself. It was the first genuine laugh he had managed all evening. Unfortunately, Ethan chose that exact moment to raise one finger from across the room. Another request. Another reason to summon her back. Claire approached again. How may I help you? Ethan tapped the menu. Tell me something. About the menu? No, he leaned back slightly. Why did you move to Boston? Claire was quiet for a moment. The question had arrived unexpectedly. That seems unrelated to dinner. Humor me. I needed a fresh start. From what? Claire studied him carefully. Most customers asked questions because they wanted information. Ethan asked questions because he wanted reactions. There was a difference. Everyone needs a fresh start from something. Ethan nodded slowly. Fair point. Then he did something strange. He looked around the restaurant. At the customers. At the staff. At the warm atmosphere surrounding them. Do you like working here? Claire followed his gaze. The people are good. That was not my question. It was my answer. Again that faint smile appeared. Smaller this time. More thoughtful. As if he was beginning to encounter something unfamiliar. Not resistance. Not fear. Something harder to categorize. Claire turned to leave. Then Ethan spoke one more time. You know everyone in this building is watching us. Claire glanced toward the dining room, where several employees quickly pretended to focus elsewhere. I noticed. Does that bother you? Should it? Ethan looked at her for several seconds, then slowly shook his head. No. Claire nodded politely and returned to her work. Behind her, Ethan remained silent for the first time all evening. Because somewhere beneath the endless requests and carefully constructed pressure, he was starting to realize something unsettling. Claire Bennett was not playing the game he expected. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Blackwell could not predict what would happen next. The evening should have been winding down by then. Most customers had finished dessert. Checks were being paid. Chairs at a few tables already sat empty beneath the soft golden lights. Yet table 12 remained occupied. Ethan Blackwell sat exactly where he had been for nearly 3 hours, watching the restaurant with the patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. Claire noticed something else too. The requests had slowed. Not disappeared. Just changed. Earlier, he had tested details. The temperature of the water. The timing of the food. The placement of silverware. Now he seemed more interested in conversations. In people. In reactions. That observation stayed in the back of her mind as she delivered coffee to another table near the front windows. Outside, a light rain continued falling across Boston. Tiny droplets streaked the glass while traffic rolled steadily through the streets below. Claire. She turned. Ethan was motioning toward her again. Several employees exchanged knowing looks. Here we go again. Claire walked over calmly. Can I get you anything? Ethan tapped the empty coffee cup in front of him. Coffee. Regular or decaf? Regular. Anything else? Sit down. Claire blinked once. I cannot do that. Why not? Because I work here. For 5 minutes. Still no. Ethan studied her face. You always follow the rules. Not always. Then why now? Claire picked up the empty cup. Because rules exist for a reason. That sounds boring. Most responsible decisions do. A nearby server nearly dropped a tray, trying not to laugh. Ethan noticed. So did Claire. The billionaire slowly leaned back. You know, most people try very hard to impress me. Do they? Constantly. Claire nodded politely. That sounds exhausting. Ethan laughed. A real laugh this time. Not the small amused smiles he had shown earlier. Several heads turned immediately. Nobody seemed accustomed to hearing that sound from him. "You are different," he said. Claire simply picked up the coffee cup. "I hear that a lot." "Do you?" "Usually from people who expected someone else." Before Ethan could respond, Claire walked toward the kitchen. The conversation should have ended there. But 5 minutes later, something happened that shifted the entire evening. At a nearby table, a young couple sat reviewing paperwork spread across the tablecloth. Mortgage documents, financial statements, a calculator. The woman looked worried. The man looked defeated. Claire had noticed them earlier. They were polite customers. Quiet. Nervous. The kind of people carrying invisible stress. As she passed by, she overheard a small piece of their conversation. "We are still $4,000 short." The woman lowered her eyes. "Then we probably lose the house." Neither noticed Ethan listening from across the room. Claire continued working. 10 minutes later, the couple requested their check. The disappointment on their faces seemed heavier than anything on the table. They gathered their documents and prepared to leave. Then the manager approached them unexpectedly. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "Your dinner has already been paid for." The couple looked confused. "By who?" The manager glanced toward table 12. Ethan immediately returned his attention to his coffee. The young couple stared in shock. "There must be a mistake." "There is not." They walked over to thank him. Ethan simply nodded. No speech. No attention. No recognition. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Claire saw something important. For the first time all night, Ethan had done something without expecting a reaction, without creating pressure, without testing anyone. Quietly, almost anonymously. When the couple finally left, Claire returned to his table carrying fresh coffee. That was kind. Ethan looked up. What was? You know what? He stared into his cup for several moments. Sometimes people need help. That is true. Do not sound so surprised. Claire considered that carefully. I am not surprised. No. No, Ethan raised an eyebrow. Everyone else seems to think I am some kind of villain. Claire set the coffee down. People are rarely only one thing. The words landed differently than either of them expected. Ethan looked away first, toward the rain beyond the windows, toward the city lights reflecting against the glass. And for the first time that evening, Claire sensed something beneath the billionaire's carefully controlled exterior. Not arrogance, not power, something quieter, something far more human. And somehow, that realization made the entire night feel much more complicated. The rain outside had grown steadier by 9 o'clock. Thin streams of water traced patterns across the restaurant windows while the city beyond softened into reflections of red brake lights and distant street lamps. Inside Harbor and Stone, the dinner crowd had thinned considerably. Only a handful of tables remained occupied. Yet nobody on staff seemed eager to leave. Something unusual was happening. They could all feel it. Ethan Blackwell was still there. More importantly, Claire Bennett was still the one serving him. The manager reviewed closing reports behind the host's stand. The bartender polished glasses that were already spotless. Even the kitchen staff occasionally peeked through the service window. Everyone was waiting for something. Nobody knew exactly what. Claire carried a tray of empty dishes toward the kitchen when she overheard two servers talking quietly near the espresso machine. I do not get it. Get what? He should have moved on by now. Maybe he is bored. No, it is something else. Claire continued walking without interrupting. People always searched for explanations, especially when situations refused to follow familiar patterns. In the kitchen, she set down the tray and checked the remaining tables in her section. Only 3 were left. Table 4, Table 9, and Table 12. The famous table. The feared table. The table that somehow felt less intimidating now than it had 3 hours earlier. When she returned to the dining room, Ethan was looking through a folder of documents. Not restaurant paperwork, business reports, financial projections, charts covered in notes. Claire noticed because the pages were spread across half the table. Working late? She asked while refilling his coffee. Ethan glanced up. Someone has to. I am fairly certain several million people are still working right now. Fair point. Claire smiled slightly. Ethan looked at her for a moment. You always answer questions like that? Like what? As if you have already thought about them. Most questions are not new. Ethan closed the folder. That sounds like something a professor would say. Maybe. Were you a professor? No, teacher. No, lawyer. Claire paused. Only briefly. Yet Ethan noticed. He seemed to notice everything. Interesting, he said softly. Claire shook her head. You use that word too much. Do I? Constantly. Ethan laughed. And what does that tell you? Claire considered the question. That you spend a lot of time studying people. The laughter disappeared. Not because he was offended. Because she had landed closer to the truth than he expected. Ethan folded his hands together. Maybe I like understanding what motivates people. And have you figured it out? Ethan looked around the nearly empty restaurant. Most of the time. Claire followed his gaze. And tonight? For the first time, he did not answer immediately. A long silence settled between them. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers overhead. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coffee machine hissed. Tonight, Ethan finally said, I am less certain. Claire nodded once. That happens sometimes. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. Mr. Blackwell. Both turned. A sharply dressed man stood near the entrance. Mid-50s. Expensive suit. Expensive watch. The kind of person who carried importance like a second jacket. The manager immediately straightened. Several employees recognized him from local business publications. Ethan's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not annoyance. Recognition. David. The man approached the table. I have been calling for an hour. I was busy. David looked around the restaurant. Then at Claire. Then back at Ethan. Confusion flashed across his face. Busy. Ethan gestured toward the empty chair. Sit down. David remained standing. The acquisition meeting starts at 7 tomorrow morning. I know. The board expects answers. They will get them. David lowered his voice. You skipped a dinner with 3 investors to sit here? The question hung in the air. Several nearby employees suddenly became fascinated by anything other than the conversation. Ethan looked completely unbothered. Apparently, David stared at him as though seeing a stranger. Then his gaze shifted toward Claire once more. Who exactly is she? The dining room fell noticeably quieter. Claire felt every eye in the building move toward Ethan. Waiting. Watching. Curious. And Ethan Blackwell, a man known for measuring people by titles, accomplishments, and influence, looked directly at Claire before answering with 4 simple words. That is what I am trying to figure out. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The statement lingered in the air long after Ethan finished saying it. David looked from Ethan to Claire and back again, searching for an explanation that never came. Claire remained calm. She had spent enough time around successful people to recognize when a room suddenly shifted. This was one of those moments. David finally pulled out the empty chair and sat down. I have worked with you for 12 years, he said. You skipped investors for this? Ethan folded his business reports and placed them neatly aside. For a conversation. With a waitress? Several employees froze when they heard the word. Not because it was insulting, because of how casually it had been used. As if it explained everything. Claire noticed Ethan's expression change. Only slightly. Yet the change was unmistakable. With Claire, Ethan corrected. David blinked. The correction seemed to surprise him. Fine. Claire. He turned toward her politely. No offense intended. None taken, Claire replied. David nodded, though he still looked confused. I simply do not understand what is happening. Neither do I, Ethan admitted. That answer surprised everyone. Ethan Blackwell was not known for uncertainty. His reputation had been built on decisions. Billion-dollar decisions. High-pressure decisions. The kind of decisions that determine the future of entire companies. Yet tonight he sounded almost reflective. You know what I think? David asked. Ethan leaned back. This should be interesting. David gestured toward the restaurant. I think you are doing what you always do. And what is that? Testing people. The dining room seemed quieter than ever. Even the rain outside felt distant. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Claire. She was standing beside the table with a coffee pot in one hand and a perfectly neutral expression on her face. What do you think? He asked her. Claire considered the question carefully. About what? About David's theory. She glanced between the 2 men. I think you ask a lot of questions. David laughed. That is the most diplomatic answer I have ever heard. It was not diplomacy. Claire set the coffee pot down. It was observation. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. You do not seem interested in impressing people. She paused. You seem interested in understanding them. Ethan remained silent. Claire continued. The problem is that most people feel judged when they realize they are being studied. David slowly nodded. That actually sounds accurate. Ethan stared at the table for several moments. Then he smiled. Not the calculated smile everyone had seen earlier. Something more genuine. More tired. You know the strange part? He said quietly. She is right. David leaned back in disbelief. You are admitting that. Why not? Ethan shrugged. I built companies by evaluating people. Hiring people. Trusting people. Sometimes the wrong people. His gaze drifted toward the rain-covered windows. After a while, you start paying attention to everything. Claire listened without interrupting. How they react under pressure. How they treat strangers. Whether they stay calm when things become difficult. David crossed his arms. And you do that in restaurants. Ethan laughed softly. Among other places. Claire finally understood. Not completely, but enough. The endless requests. The unusual questions. The constant observation. None of it had been random. He had not been studying service. He had been studying people. That sounds exhausting, she said. Ethan looked at her. It is. The answer arrived so quickly that it caught even him by surprise. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire did something unexpected. She pulled a pen from her apron and pointed toward the stack of reports beside him. May I ask you a question? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Of course. How many hours have you been working today? David immediately smiled. Oh, this should be good. Ethan thought about it. Since 6 this morning. And what time is it now? He glanced at his watch. Almost 10. Claire nodded. Then I think you are asking the wrong questions tonight. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Meaning? Claire gestured toward the reports. You have spent 4 hours trying to figure out everyone else. Her eyes met his steadily. Maybe you should spend 5 minutes figuring out why you are still here. The silence that followed felt completely different from all the others. Not tense. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. David stared at Ethan. Ethan stared at Claire. And for the first time all evening, the billionaire had absolutely no answer. The words stayed with Ethan long after Claire walked away. Maybe you should spend 5 minutes figuring out why you are still here. It was such a simple observation. Not clever. Not dramatic. Yet somehow it landed harder than any argument he had heard in years. David watched him carefully. She has a point. Ethan rubbed his jaw and stared out at the rain. I know. That might be the first time I have heard you say those words. Ethan laughed quietly. Do not get used to it. But David noticed something unusual. Ethan was no longer studying Claire. He was studying himself. For a man who spent most of his life analyzing markets, competitors, executives, and investors, that was unfamiliar territory. Across the dining room, Claire continued closing out her remaining tables. She did not look toward table 12. She did not wait for approval. She did not seem concerned with whatever impact her words might have had. That, more than anything, fascinated Ethan. Most people adjusted their behavior around power. Some became overly polite. Others became nervous. Some tried to impress him. Claire did none of those things. She treated him exactly the same way she treated everyone else. An elderly couple. A college student. A billionaire. The standard never changed. 20 minutes later, the last customers prepared to leave. Chairs were being stacked. The music had softened. Harbor and Stone was approaching closing time. The manager walked over carrying the final reports from the evening. Everything looks good, he said. Strong night. David glanced at the paperwork, then suddenly froze. Wait. He pointed toward a page. This reservation. The manager looked down. What about it? David exchanged a look with Ethan. This is one of the investors from tomorrow morning. Ethan sat up slightly. What? The manager nodded. Private dinner reservation. Scheduled for tomorrow at 7. Ethan took the paper and immediately recognized the name. Harrison Cole, one of the most influential investors involved in the acquisition discussions. David frowned. That is strange. Why? Asked the manager. David looked toward Ethan. Because Harrison called earlier today, threatening to walk away from the deal. The manager blinked. Seriously? Ethan nodded. We have spent 2 months negotiating. David folded his arms. If he backs out, the entire acquisition becomes much more complicated. The conversation might have ended there. Except Claire happened to be walking past at that exact moment. She heard the name. Harrison Cole. Her steps slowed slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. You know him? Claire hesitated. Not personally. David looked interested. Then, Claire glanced toward the paperwork. I know his reputation. Ethan leaned forward. And, Claire thought for a moment. He is not actually interested in numbers. David laughed. He is an investor. Of course he is interested in numbers. Not first, Claire replied calmly. First he wants trust. The table went quiet. Go on, Ethan said. Claire looked at the reservation sheet. 3 years ago, he pulled funding from a company that looked profitable because he did not trust the leadership team. David's expression changed. How do you know that? It was public information. Ethan studied her carefully. Most people would not remember something like that. Claire offered a small shrug. Most people are not curious about the same things. David looked back toward Ethan. She might be right. Ethan slowly nodded. She is. Then something clicked. A detail. A realization. He suddenly understood why tomorrow's meeting had been struggling. The entire negotiation had focused on projections, assets, and valuations. Nobody had focused on trust. For the first time all week, the path forward seemed obvious. Ethan looked at Claire. You just solved a problem my team has been arguing about for 6 days. Claire smiled politely. I only mentioned an observation. Exactly. Ethan sat back and shook his head in disbelief. Around them, employees quietly watched the exchange unfold. The feared billionaire. The man who spent years evaluating everyone else. Now sitting speechless because a waitress had noticed something his entire executive team had missed. And in that moment, Ethan finally understood why he was still there. He had not been testing Claire Bennett at all. Somehow, without either of them realizing it, Claire Bennett had been testing him. For a long moment, nobody moved. The realization settled over the table like the final note of a song. Ethan Blackwell looked at Claire Bennett and saw something he had missed all evening. Not intelligence. He had noticed that hours ago. Not confidence. He had noticed that too. What he had missed was perspective. Claire was not trying to impress him. She was not trying to win an argument. She was not trying to gain anything at all. She simply said what she believed to be true. And somehow that had become the most valuable thing in the room. The manager stood nearby pretending to organize receipts. The bartender was suddenly polishing the same glass for the 3rd time. Even David seemed unusually quiet. Ethan slowly closed the folder containing his reports. You know, he said, my executive team spent 6 days analyzing that problem. Claire smiled faintly. Maybe they were looking at the wrong thing. Ethan nodded. Apparently they were. He looked down at the reservation sheet again. Then back at Claire. What did you do before this? The question arrived without challenge this time. Without strategy. It sounded almost sincere. Claire considered it carefully. A lot of things. Ethan laughed softly. That sounds familiar. People are complicated. They are. Another silence followed. Comfortable this time. The kind that no longer needed to be filled. Outside, the rain had finally begun to slow. The streets glistened beneath the city lights. Inside Harbor and Stone, the staff had nearly completed their closing routine. The evening was ending. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a business card. The movement immediately drew attention from several employees who happened to be watching. Claire noticed it too. He placed the card on the table. I would like to offer you a job. A few feet away, someone nearly dropped a stack of menus. Claire looked at the card but did not pick it up. Doing what? Anything you want. David laughed. That is the most flexible job description I have ever heard. Ethan ignored him. Research. Strategy. Consulting. Operations. Pick a department. Claire glanced at the card again. Then at Ethan. You do not even know my resume. I know enough. That seems risky. Not really. Ethan smiled. You solved the problem tonight without trying to. Claire folded her arms lightly. And if I say no? Ethan's smile widened. Then you say no. The answer surprised several people listening nearby. Perhaps even Ethan himself. Claire studied him for a second before shaking her head gently. I appreciate the offer. Ethan waited. But I think you are still asking the wrong question. David covered his face with one hand. This is becoming a pattern. Ethan laughed. What question should I be asking? Claire looked around the nearly empty restaurant. At the employees finishing their shifts. At the manager counting receipts. At the bartender cleaning the final glasses of the night. Then she looked back at Ethan. Why do you assume? Everyone wants to leave where they are. The question caught him completely off guard. Claire continued. You see potential and immediately think about moving people somewhere else. She smiled. Maybe sometimes people are already building something exactly where they are. Ethan stared at her, then slowly nodded. Fair point. David looked between them. I feel like I accidentally attended a philosophy class tonight. That finally broke the tension. Everyone laughed. Even the manager. Even the bartender. And surprisingly, Ethan laughed the hardest. A few minutes later he stood and put on his coat. The restaurant had officially closed. Chairs rested upside down on tables. The lights had dimmed. Ethan picked up the business card and handed it to Claire anyway. Keep it. She accepted it politely. Why? Because if you ever decide you need something, I would like the opportunity to answer the phone. Claire looked at the card, then slipped it into her apron pocket. Fair enough. Ethan nodded once. Not as a billionaire. Not as a customer. Just as a person. Thank you, Claire. For dinner? She asked. For perspective. For a second, neither said anything else. Then Ethan and David walked toward the door. The rain had stopped completely by the time they stepped outside. Claire watched them disappear into the quiet Boston night before returning to help finish closing the restaurant. Around her, conversations slowly resumed. The spell of the evening was broken. Yet something had changed. Not only for Ethan, for everyone who had witnessed it. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one with the most money, the biggest title, or the loudest voice. Sometimes it is simply the person who remains calm enough to tell the truth. And that night, everyone learned the same lesson. Respect is never demanded. It is recognized.